So thank you for attending our Vibrio Control meeting. This is the second one that we are doing in person. We had our meeting in Duxbury yesterday. We will also be having a virtual meeting at 5 o'clock on May 14th. So that virtual meeting does have a registration. So if you did not, or if, Nancy, Devin, if your constituents are not here and want to attend that virtual meeting, just remind them that they'll have to register for the virtual meeting. So we'll get started. So we're going to touch a little bit on basic shellfish harvest and handling requirements, and then we'll get into the Vibrio specific requirements. I'm Chrissy Pettipass. I'm the Shellfish Program Leader. I'm here with Alex Boeri. Alex Boeri is the new aquaculture program or aquaculture project leader. We have Gabe. You all know Gabe well. He's been working with you for many years now. Eric Hickey from the Department of Public Health is here with us, and any of those questions that are more on the dealer end that just last night we got a call and I'm like, I don't know, I have to call Eric. So we got a three-way call going. The poor officer was directed to the NSSP, and we got an email this morning saying, yeah, thanks for the 502-page light reading. We understand that there are a lot of regulations. There's a lot of red tape involved in particularly oysters. It being a raw product, it's one of the riskier in terms of public health. So we do have these, somewhat stringent control measures that we take during the Vibrio season. So to get into some basic harvest and handling, this is stuff everybody knows, but we're just going to review. You're only allowed to harvest in shellfish growing areas that are classified as approved or conditionally approved and in the open status. Status is very important to pay attention, especially, we're in Eastham. I'm well aware that, the Eastham, Orleans growers in the Nauset system have been, I have to stop doing that, or you've been under a shellfish closure for a while now due to biotoxin. And I know that's something, it can be difficult and frustrating to be closed for extended periods of time. We've had more and more grumblings. I've heard it firsthand. I've gotten phone calls from an individual that said they don't believe the closures are necessary, DMF's being overly cautious. Those biotoxin closures are a different beast than when we close something down due to bacteria. Bacteria is an indicator of pollution. The bacteria itself isn't necessarily going to make people sick. The PSP, we're measuring actual toxin. We're not talking about an indicator organism that gives an idea of risk. There's actual neurotoxin in the shellfish. And so the Nauset system is becoming more and more challenging, and we need to make sure everybody's on board because somebody gets sick, it could be fatal. We're talking about, we're injecting mice and they're dying immediately, so we have to dilute it till we can get them to die a little bit slower so we can get some kind of idea about how much toxicity is in that shellfish. So please, I'm begging you, take those closures seriously, because if we have an illness with biotoxin, it may be we have to permanently close down because we know that Nauset's happening. Those blooms are happening every year. So, and I'm only saying this because, like I said, I fielded the calls myself where it's like, oh, this is baloney. You guys don't know what you're talking about. And if there isn't confidence in the, justifiability of those closures, everybody's at risk if somebody gets sick. So just please pay attention to those shellfish closures. If you have any, question, call your shellfish constable. The shellfish constable will always be able to help you, and if not, they'll give us a call and make sure everybody's on the same page. We also have updated some of our regs. So for aquaculturists, you've always been under a night prohibition for harvest. That's nothing new. We recently updated our regulations to just across the board have a state regulation that says shellfish night harvest isn't allowed, including for wild harvest. So you are not allowed to harvest before a half hour before sunrise or after a half hour after sunset. Boats used in harvesting have to be kept clean. This boat over here shows an example of a boat that in rather unsanitary conditions. It's not a very good example of a harvest boat, it's just a dinghy, but clearly if your harvest boat has bird feces all over it, it's not something you want to be harvesting product that's going to be consumed raw. You want to make sure that shellfish stored on the boat are on some kind of raised area to prevent contact with any of chemicals, petroleum, bilge water, that's something that could adulterate your product. The shellfish should be covered to prevent exposure from both the sun and birds. That's pretty much all the time when you're harvesting, you should keep that into consideration. That's not just a Vibrio season thing. I know this is one that you all, get frustrated with because you're harvesting product that's going to be consumed raw and you have a bucket that says human waste on your boat. Unfortunately, that is something that is required. The National Shellfish Sanitation Program Model Ordinance, which is the mandatory compliance part of it, actually is very explicit, right down to saying that the letters have to be at least 3 inches, and it literally has to say human waste. And you have to have that on your boat when you're out on your grant. I think maybe the only exception is if you're very, very close to a landing and there's a porta potty right at that landing. You can say, look, the landing's right there. If I have to, use the restroom, I will go there. And so, but if you're, far out on the flats, you need to make sure you have that waste, human waste bucket, either on your boat or even on your truck. If, in the case of Wellfleet, where you're kind of going all the way out, they have such vast flats. You want to make sure you have that with you. And obviously, it goes without being said, but the containers have to be disposed of in an appropriate manner if you do have to use them. So, dispose of the sewage in an appropriate sewage receptacle. Dogs, cats, and other animals aren't allowed on your harvest vessel or on your aquaculture site. If you're not using your boat to harvest, you still shouldn't have the animals on your aquaculture site, but if you're not wild harvesting or not harvesting from your grant, there's nothing that says you can't have your dog on your boat then, but it's specifically when you're harvesting. When it comes to having a dog, say, on your truck, you have to make sure that the dog is not in the same space as the product. So if you had an open truck, you could have the dog in your cab if the shellfish are in the bed of the truck. But you need to make sure that there's separation there. Under all cases, you have to have a tag on your shellfish. So whether you're going to the market, whether you're taking it to your off-site culling location at your home, even if you're taking some of your product home for personal consumption, you want to slap a tag on it that says personal consumption, so that if you're pulled over anywhere, a police officer understands the disposition and your intent for that shellfish.
Where do you get those?
The tags that say personal consumption, or just in general. So there are several places. I know Cape Fish sells tags. That's actually something we were just talking about, because I don't have a good idea of all of the vendors where tags are available. I've had people ask me, and I would be...
On the tag?
I'm sorry?
What goes on the tag?
We're going to get into all of that in just a minute.
Okay, sorry.
No worries. I'm glad you're excited to know. And then another thing is, and this was actually another update to our regulation, only ice made from an approved source may be applied to the shellfish for any reason. So we made it abundantly clear in the regulation that it's not just market-bound shellfish. If you're going to be applying ice even for overwintering or basically any reason at all, the ice needs to come from a sanitary source. This sort of came to a head when we found out that people were scraping up Zamboni ice from the skating rink parking lot and using it to overwinter oysters. Now, we completely understand that none of that product's going completely to the market. It's going to go back to the aquaculture site and be resubmerged for at least 14 days. But we really don't have any studies that show what how they're getting contaminated with blood, spit, puke. You know what goes on an ice hockey rink, right? So that's just something that we don't want happening. And so we made it clear in the reg change that you have to have an approved source. And so that approved source, any commercial ice, if you purchase it commercially, those establishments will be inspected by DPH. So any of those commercial properties should be retail ice should be an approved source. Or you can make it from your home water as long as if it's it's tested, right? So we have these rules with the Vibrio Control plan. I'm sure you all have checked whether or not you're making your own ice. You can also make ice from the seawater, should you choose to. So your growing area in the approved status, you can use that to make ice as well. Okay, another update, which really isn't anything new, we just made it more clear, is that your tags, and so here we go, we're going to talk about all the things that should be on a tag when you're going to market. You should have your harvester tag. It'll have the name, your harvest permit number, your harvest date, and the time of harvest, and we'll get more into the time of harvest in a little bit. You also want the time of icing if it's in Vibrio Control season. If we're not in Vibrio Control season, then you don't have to have a time of icing. You don't have to use ice. But as we'll get into later, even if we are outside of Vibrio Control season, as you all know, we're having some crazy weather lately. You know, we could very well have an 80-degree day in early November. And so if we have a really, really hot day, and technically you don't have to use ice, you really should, you know, as a precaution, use it anyway, because if we end up having an illness outbreak, and an illness outbreak, there are a couple of levels, triggers for calling something an outbreak, but the easiest one to meet is 2 people getting sick from oysters or any shellfish harvested from the same growing area with the same harvest date, same people. It doesn't even have to be the same people, actually. It could be if it's from the same growing area on the same harvest date. That's as simple as you're going out with a buddy who doesn't live in your same household. So that's one of the things that one of the qualifiers. If they're in different households, they both got sick, and the shellfish came from the same growing area, harvested on the same date, that's an outbreak, and we're required to close the area down. And if we never had a Vibrio Control plan in place, we're now required to implement a Vibrio Control plan. So obviously we've hit that trigger for oysters. We have not for clams, and let's keep it that way. We do not want to have to implement a Vibrio Control plan and have icing for clams. So let's knock on wood that we maintain that level of just incidental, episodic illnesses associated with clams, and nothing that reaches an outbreak trigger. Harvest area. So this slide is focusing on the harvest area. In this particular case, and I'm using Wellfleet as an example, since Wellfleet has the most growers out of any other community, we have CCB 13. And as you can see, the area, so all of the colored areas represent a single overall growing area, shellfish growing area, CCB 13. But that area is divided into sub-areas that have different classifications. So you'll see on the north, we have the red hatched. That's prohibited, where there can be no harvest out of that area except maybe some seed collection. The blue hatch is conditionally approved. That means it meets the standards for an open status for harvesting for direct human consumptions under some conditions, but then there are other conditions where there's some water quality degradation, or there's some other rule that requires us to have it to be conditionally approved. It's not always necessarily associated with water quality. It could be with risk, and an example of that is mooring areas. So mooring areas are considered risky in terms of the potential for boats to discharge their waste. So we have to reclassify areas as conditionally approved if there are 20 or more boats. We recently made a change in the model ordinance at the last conference. It used to be just boats. We had to, if there were over 20 boats, it had to be a mooring area, and some of our Northeast states put in a proposal to say, we don't want to have to count little sailboats that the yacht clubs teach the kids. That's not really risk there. And so we managed to get adopted into the model ordinance that we only have to count boats that have actual marine sanitation devices on them. So some of the areas that we have had to reclassify as conditionally approved, if they don't meet that boats with MSD definition, we can now change them back to straight approved rather than conditionally approved. And so again, in that case, it was due to a model ordinance requirement and not necessarily because we're finding impaired water quality. And so the green hatch is the approved, and if you notice on that map, technically the area, and in this particular scenario, I'm saying quahogs were harvested on that south little corner in Chipman's Cove. So that growing area is CCB 13.0. So you want to make sure that you put that 0.0 on your tag, because a dealer is supposed to be looking at that tag and knowing, what areas are open, what areas are closed, and if that tag just says 13, technically CCB 13.1 is 13, right? That's a prohibited area. You're not really telling that dealer, or if we have an illness and we have to trace it back, or if you want your product to go to the European Union, right? So product harvested in CCB 13.4, my eyeballs aren't getting bad, or 13.3, that product can't go to the European Union because the European Union will not take product from the conditionally approved, but will from CCB 13.0. So you want to make sure that we have the most precise growing area designation, and we also want to make sure that it has the initials MA in front of it. So MA CCB 13.0, or MA OC5, right? So you want to make, or 5.0, whatever it applies, you want to make sure you have that decimal point. This URL code will take you to the DMF website where we have all of the maps of all of our shellfish growing areas. Pretty much every area has a map just like this. And so if you go to that website, and this presentation will be posted on DMF's website, so you'll be able to access it and go to that, access the QRL code at a later date if you'd like. But you can see, find your growing area wherever you may be interested. Okay, bulk tagging for culling and overwintering. So this applies to aquaculturists only. Again, the Vibrio Control Plan applies to all oyster harvest, including wild harvest, but certain things only apply to aquaculturists. You can have your propagation permit endorsed for off-site culling or off-site overwintering, and you are allowed to bulk tag. So for market-sized product, every individual, when you're going to the market-bound product, every individual bag or container needs to have a tag. But if you're just moving product around for the purposes of animal husbandry, whether it's off-site culling or overwintering, you can have a single tag that, basically says your intent for that product, aquaculturally reared, to be culled or overwintered, or if you're going back to the site, check the one that says aquaculturally reared, culled or overwintered for return to site. But you can actually have, one tag. Even if you have different fish totes, you can have the one tag that says 6 fish totes, and just make sure you have the appropriate number, and it's accurate for that specific lot. Like we've had people have a tag already done, and they're off-site culling, and then they're coming back for another lot, and they just stick that tag with it. But last time they had 6 totes, and this time they have 10 totes, and they don't update anything. They just kind of move the tag around. You want to make sure that that tag accurately reflects what you're moving at that given time. For overwintered product, you want to make sure that when we have the new season approaching, it goes back to your aquaculture site, and it needs to be resubmerged in the water for 14 days before you can harvest it for the market. And so you just basically, and you can use a tag too. If you're not bringing everything back on one day, you want to make sure you track which day that certain lots went back on your site, so that each lot has a full 14 days of just basically sort of reconditioning, and if there was any kind of temperature abuse during the overwintering storage period, that it has a chance to pump and purge any contaminants it may have come in contact with. Okay. Now we get into Vibrio. And so what are Vibrio? Vibrio are bacteria. It's naturally occurring. It's pretty much everywhere. All our water bodies have Vibrio. They're a very diverse genus of bacteria. So we have different species of Vibrio that are of concern. The Vibrio species that is the subject of our Vibrio Control Plan is Vibrio parahemolyticus. There's also Vibrio cholera, Vibrio vulnificus. Vibrio vulnificus has gotten a lot of attention in the last couple years due to a lot of the headlines about the flesh-eating bacteria. And that's something that industry and the state authorities have taken issue with, because if you look at some of the media coverage of the people dying from this flesh-eating bacteria, almost invariably those illnesses come from wound infection, yet also almost invariably these articles have oysters on the, associated with the story, and it's giving a false narrative that oyster consumption is equated with that particular type of illness. So it is a Vibrio, but it's not the Vibrio species that is the subject of this control plan. But it is something that is a concern, and we would have to have a Vibrio vulnificus control plan if we ended up getting a Vibrio vulnificus outbreak. But as I said, it's typically wound infection that it gives the risk with Vibrio vulnificus. But Vibrios are the fastest of all known bacteria, fastest growing of all known bacteria, especially at high temperatures. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but at high temperatures, their growth within the shellfish meats is very, very fast. Not all Vibrio parahemolyticus is pathogenic, so not all of those Vibrio parahemolyticus strains cause illness. And so scientists have discovered certain genetic markers that are correlated with illness, and so one such is that, thermostable direct, TDH. So you don't need to know any of this, but if you wanted to know a little bit of the science, or if you heard those, TDH and TRH, that all has to do with genetic markers and helps us to gauge whether some of the virulence genes are associated with illness. And science has shown that those genes tend to be correlated with illness. The Vibrios that don't have those genes are a little less likely to be associated with getting people sick. Vibriosis causes a lot of illnesses every year, and about 45,000 of those illnesses are associated with the consumption of contaminated food. As I mentioned, there's a lot of wound infection associated with vibriosis also. So the CDC, and these, I haven't updated this slide in the last couple years, and so the CDC may have updated numbers, but a couple years ago, 500 hospitalizations, about 100 deaths per year in the U.S. So it's an issue that we need to pay attention to. VP, so Vibrio parahemolyticus, is the leading cause of seafood-borne illness, and the vast majority, 87%, require no medical attention. And so if you get sick with Vibrio, it's typical gastrointestinal distress, right? You're going to think of food poisoning or stomach bug. You're going to have diarrhea, vomiting. You're going to be miserable for a couple days, maybe 3. And usually the onset is within 24 hours, but most of us probably won't go to the hospital, right? We're just going to bear it and get better in a few days. So it's estimated that the Vibrio illnesses are vastly underreported. If somebody does go to the hospital and it's cultured, then we have to pay attention to that. And as I mentioned, if it reaches certain levels of illnesses, we have to close down the growing area. Typically, Vibrio is associated with the consumption of raw or undercooked seafood, particularly oysters. A well-cooked product should kill all that bacteria. That is completely different from the biotoxin. You can cook, burn, freeze, do whatever you want to that shellfish. It's not going to get rid of biotoxin, but well-cooked shellfish will kill Vibrios. We do get some Vibrio illnesses with cooked product. It could be it wasn't cooked properly. It could be there was cross-contamination at the restaurant, and sometimes there's evidence of that. If there is evidence of that, say we have a Vibrio illness, it gets reported into, actually we have MAVEN, it's our Massachusetts Virtual Epidemiologic Network, where DPH usually gets notified after the local Board of Health, right, puts it into the system. And then there's a trace back. And even if it is traced back to a growing area, single growing area, if we have proof that the restaurant mishandled it, then we don't have to close down your growing area. But if we don't have proof that it was some kind of post-harvest abuse, then we have to close down the growing area. And it can be hard to they may very well have been some kind of post-harvest abuse that you have no control over. But it's hard to capture that if you don't catch them in the act, right? So, I acknowledge how vulnerable you all are. It's like you give your product, it goes down the supply chain, and, you might get closed down because any number of the hands handling your product down the chain did something wrong, but you're the one that's going to end up getting your area closed if there's an outbreak. So, I just want to acknowledge how frustrating that is. I understand completely, but that's also where, this sort of education about, preventing the temperature abuse and proper handling, and where we have DPH, going and doing those tracebacks. It's a lot of effort, I think, on your staff to do those tracebacks and actually go into restaurants and go into the dealers and make sure that their temperature logs inside their refrigerators are, all up to date, and they're doing all the record keeping, because we want to find that out.
How many people have died in this state since we've been monitoring this from Vibrio? How many people have died?
Have died since we've been.
People have been severely hospitalized for 6 months, 3 months, whatever. I'm just curious, have we got any stats on that?
I don't know that we have stats, and I know one that hit the headlines was somebody was on vacation here, spent 6 months in the hospital, and this was a 40-year-old person, but I think was it a really rare strain of Vibrio parahemolyticus?
Yeah, I mean, you could track it through Maven at DPH, and I guess that information could be assembled. I don't know of any deaths of Massachusetts citizens who consume Massachusetts oysters. I know there was one death associated with a Vibrio case that was reported to us, but I think it was oyster sourced someplace else. You may recall the very first case we had, which has now become, now is in the public forum due to lawsuits and stuff, and it has appeared in the Cape Cod Times, et cetera. But that individual, who was a relatively young person who had no pre-existing conditions and was in good health, was down for almost a year, and supposedly had to go to a rehab and experience organ failure, stuff like that. And that, cases around that time in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic were very severe, and that was the original concern when we first dealt with Vibrio. Is just the virulence. The attack rate was very high, which is a term used by epidemiologists to demonstrate, statistically that, out of the total amount of people exposed, a higher rate of people are actually getting sick. So don't quote me on this, but Vibrio was typically, I think, somewhere around 3 out of 10, and the strains we were seeing was something like 6 out of 10 or something like that. There was definitely a significant disparity there, and so yeah, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you, but I mean that's stuff that goes into that Maven system, which tracks everything about the illness. Now some of that obviously is protected data that can't be shared with the public, but
Yep.
it would make it
That's the
interesting.
same person I think I know.
Yeah.
A long time ago. He probably suffered the most. But I thought he had an immune problem too.
So there was immune problem.
I think he did.
Yeah.
I'm going by what I have seen in quite frankly, the newspaper online. That was a while ago.
I didn't know if that lawsuit was still going on. I didn't check it. It's still going on?
I don't know.
The vast majority of Vibrio illnesses that we track in Massachusetts are older, typically immunocompromised individuals. And we also have had many cases of Vibrio where other people in the party ate the same oysters and did not get sick.
I mean, if you eat a lot of oysters, you probably have Vibrio in your system anyways. I mean, you have a certain amount, so if you get tested in emergency ward, they're gonna say, if you're sick, they're gonna say Vibrio, right? That's what they're gonna say.
Yeah, and despite, some really great effort by, the scientific community that's involved in this, we've just not been able to identify what's called the infective dose, right? How many cells. I mean, we know, with norovirus, it's very few cells and, makes everybody sick. But with Vibrio, it's just much more difficult to predict this. It seems to me, just by my familiarity with the data over the last few years, that the cases are more typical. The types of exposures and the individuals who get it. But, if you recall, when we first were dealing with this back in, 2012, 2013, it was young people were getting sick. Healthy people were getting sick, and the symptoms were very acute, and the recovery time was longer. And now it seems like things are trending, in a more positive direction. But, we still had a fairly robust Vibrio year in 2023, and you will see a slide in a little bit.
Yep, and I think those, as Eric mentioned, we had been seeing these in the last 2 decades, an increase in Vibrio illnesses. That's why we implemented the Vibrio Control Plan. But since implementing these control measures and these limiting the temperature abuse, we've, decreased and sort of kept leveled off the number of Vibrio illnesses. So the first illness outbreak, again, we reached the threshold of 2 or more illnesses epidemiologically linked to oysters harvested on the same calendar day from the same growing area. In 2011 was the first time that we had that happen. In 2012, we implemented our first Vibrio Control Plan, but it was only for Eastern Cape Cod Bay because that was the source of the Vibrio outbreak. In 2013, we implemented the Vibrio Control Plan statewide. As I mentioned, we've had no outbreaks of in hard clams, so we the Vibrio Control Plan does not apply to hard clams or any other shellfish beyond the oysters. This only applies to oysters. So on the bottom left, we have a plot showing the number of sole source. So sole source means it was traced back to a single growing area. So Vibrio illnesses. And that's Vibrio illnesses that are parahemolyticus and what we call Vibrio SP. SP means that we know it was Vibrio, it was confirmed to be Vibrio, but the hospital or clinic did not culture the sample to see what species it was. Now, a Vibrio that gets somebody sick is likely parahemolyticus around here. So it's something we need to pay more and more attention to because there's an increased trend in not culturing. They call it culture-independent diagnostic tests. And so since the hospitals and the clinics are not doing the culture because it's a more time-consuming process, we may very well have a good percentage of VPs that are just not being confirmed species-wise. So we put together the Vibrio parahemolyticus and Vibrio SP, which means it's Vibrio, we just don't know which species, together in this left plot. And last year, the last Vibrio season, we had 16 illnesses that could be traced to a single Massachusetts growing area. The plot on the lower right-hand side basically shows the trend in both our landings of oysters from 2011 to last year, 2023, in the blue. And in the green, we have the number of single-source Vibrio cases per million oysters landed. So that sort of gets to a risk factor of how much illnesses per number of oysters landed. We don't really have a good handle on what a serving size is. Like the model ordinance expects us or asks that we do an assessment of risk per serving. But what's a serving? Is it 6 oysters? Is it 12 oysters? I don't know. So we've used this sort of million oyster metric. And you can see in 2013, we had the highest rate of illness per million oysters landed. And as we've implemented the Vibrio Control Plan, and industry has gotten really good at adhering to and conforming to the Vibrio Control Plan, that number of that rate of illness per harvest is really leveled off. And for the same reasons already mentioned, some people are just vulnerable, right? And I don't think we're ever going to get to a zero risk. It's just something that there's inherently some risk to it, and some people are more vulnerable to it, and we're going to get some illnesses. You can do everything right. You could follow the Vibrio Control Plan to a T, and you might still get somebody, falling ill from the consumption of your oysters. I've had that happen where we got an illness, it got traced back to somebody, so we have to go to that person and just verify, what's your process, how are you handling the oysters, and they're so upset, they're like upset that somebody got sick off their oysters, but they really didn't do anything wrong. But the more diligent we can be with getting them cooled down, the more we can minimize that risk. Yep.
Any idea why oysters more so than hard clams are?
Because they're raw. Because people are more likely to eat them raw. I know people eat little necks and things raw, but the vast majority of oysters sold, certainly in Massachusetts, are for the raw half-shell market. And so just the fact that they're not being cooked means that you're going to get more illnesses.
You mentioned about hospitalization and them culturing strains. How do they give the culture? Is it a blood?
Poop. Yep, it's a stool sample. I'm not going to get into this slide, but I put it up there because this presentation is going to be on the website. So you guys can go access it later if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of where the illnesses happened and whether they were Vibrio or Vibrio species with the unidentified specific species, or whether it came from in-state or out-of-state or mixed. All that information is in that slide, and you can access it at a later date. So if you want to get to this presentation, the current Vibrio Control Plan, this specific meeting is being recorded and will also be posted to this website. This URL code will take you to our website where it has all that information. So currently the Vibrio Control Plan, which has been developed with in the collaboration with the Division of Marine Fisheries, the Department of Public Health, the Mass Environmental Police and local boards of health also. Local boards of health are usually the first to find out about the illnesses and have them input into the MAVEN system, and it kind of triggers that trace back effort. The VP season is currently May 19th through October 19th, and that's inclusive, so October 20th is the first day that the Vibrio Control Plan isn't required. But as I mentioned, you should pay attention to temperatures, and if the temperatures are high, it really behooves you to take it upon yourself to ice anyway. And it applies to all market-sized oysters. So for aquacultured oysters, market size is 2.5 inches. For wild oysters, it's 3 inches. If you're off-site culling or just culling seed that is nowhere near market-sized, then the Vibrio Control Plan and the requirement to resubmerge, which we will get into in a minute, doesn't apply, right? Because it's going to take longer than 10 days for it to get to market size in all likelihood anyway. And so the core aspect or core principle in the Vibrio Control Plan is rapid cooling through icing. And this table on the bottom basically shows the effect of temperature on the doubling time of the bacteria in the oysters. And so oysters will warm up very quickly in the ambient air temperature. So an oyster at 50 degrees, we can see in that middle column the growth rate of the Vibrio is very, very low, right? So 0.008. That means for the bacteria burden in the meats of that shellfish to double, it's going to take 35 hours, almost 36 hours. That, shellfish, the oyster goes to 70 degrees. Now it only takes 3 hours for the bacteria load in that shellfish to double. Get to 90 degrees within an hour. So as you can see, the higher the temperature, the faster the growth rate, and the riskier that product is getting, the more abused it is temperature-wise. And so there are a couple studies done to see the effectiveness of icing. And so there are a couple different methods, or multiple methods, but we looked at the ice slurry method. And in this case, the oysters were 90 degrees, right, in the water. So they came out of the water, and apparently it was really, really hot because the water temperature was close to the air temperature, presumably. So it sort of stayed around that 90-degree temperature until the oysters went into the slurry. And as soon as it went into the slurry, the temperature dropped immediately and precipitously. And you can see that within 15 minutes, the oysters had dropped to 50 degrees. So that's very quick. In fact, in most cases where we're looking at really effective slurrying, I know the Duxbury area does a lot of slurrying, and we had the FDA come out. So every year, the FDA comes to Massachusetts and evaluates our compliance with the national program. And a couple years ago, they went to Duxbury, and the slurry method had the oysters to 45 degrees in 10 minutes. So it is a very effective way to get the oysters to temperature, if albeit a little less convenient, but it is very effective. There's also the direct icing method for cooling. In this particular case, the oysters were 75 degrees when they came out of the water. They were exposed to hot ambient temperatures, and you can see that the temperature within the oyster rose pretty rapidly during the period when it was out of, 15 minutes or so that it was out of the water. But as soon as it was iced, it took about 37 minutes to get the oysters down to 50 degrees. So it's still an effective means to get the oysters to the proper temperature within, the requirement is 10 hours. It's happening very, very quickly while it's still in the harvester's hand before it even gets to the dealer when it's appropriately iced or slurried. Okay, so general tagging requirements. One of the things I want to point out in a couple of these slides where on the top left, you see a section where it has, in this particular case, it says shellfish tagging, and then you see in red, are all the containers properly tagged? Do the tags include the following information? If it's red, that means it's a critical violation. And if it's a critical violation and you have an environmental police officer or your shellfish constable, you're likely going to get cited. The product might be destroyed. So the critical violations are really something you want to pay attention to. We do have a Vibrio compliance monitoring form that the environmental police officers and the constables have, and we're required to have these Vibrio compliance checks. The FDA expects us to show that we have good compliance with our Vibrio control plan, and that is one mechanism for us to show metrics, right? We have these inspections going on, we're showing we have a high level of compliance with Vibrio, and we do, right? We have very little examples where people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, so kudos, thank you. But if you would like to see what that form looks like, again, that URL code I showed you that takes us to our Vibrio Control website, that form is on that website. So you could see, what's in black, what is a violation but not considered a critical, and what is a critical that would, really get you, potentially have our legal people put you at an administrative hearing to see if they want to suspend the license, the permit or not. So tagging, as we mentioned, all market-bound product needs to be tagged. It needs to be tagged before reaching the landing site. And you want to make sure it has the time of harvest, time of icing, the harvest date, harvest area, and the harvester ID. Again, even if it's not market-bound, everything should have a tag if you're handling shellfish. And the tag must be attached to all containers of shellfish or shell stock before reaching the landing site. We will get into icing tags, but first we'll get into time of harvest. Yep.
I have a question about the monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
What are the requirements for the towns in terms of how often they should be, they're required to inspect?
Yeah, there is no hard and fast rule, and it depends on how many aquaculturists are in a town, right? Nancy, for example, has a ton of aquaculturists, and so, we'll be lucky for the town to hit everybody once in the season. For others, where they may only have a handful, we'd be looking to try to, get people maybe monthly. There are limitations with staff capacity, right? But the more we get, the more we can show these metrics that can show FDA, yes, we're handling it, we're doing our best to minimize the risk, and our industry is implementing and complying with the program at a very high level. And I think we've been able to show that through these forms. You're welcome. So time of harvest. So we talked a little bit about lots, but harvester lot means a bunch of oysters identified with the harvester taggers having the same time of harvest from a single growing area and from a single harvester. And so whenever we refer to lot, those three things pretty much define it. Market bound is what it sounds like. It's going to a dealer and it's being landed to go into the market that calendar day. Time of harvest, that can be a little bit tricky, that definition. So for subtidal areas, and subtidal means that it's covered in water all the time. So for areas that are not in the intertidal zone that get exposed naturally, it's whenever you pluck that first oyster out of the water. That's the time of harvest. Now, it could take you an hour to finish that lot, but the time of harvest isn't when you finish the lot, it's when that first oyster came out of the water. For intertidal areas, so those areas that get exposed naturally with the tide, the time of harvest is either when it gets plucked from the water, so you could, as long as it's on an ebbing tide, you take it out of the water and your site just happens to be in an area where it hasn't been exposed yet, or the time of harvest is when it got naturally exposed by tide. Even if you hadn't actually harvested it yet, the time of harvest is when the tide exposed it. And so we want to make sure that you have the accurate time of harvest, even if that means you weren't even necessarily on your site. There's a chance that the time of harvest could even have been technically at night, right? It was prior to a half hour before sunrise. But as long as it's within your 2 hours to icing, you can still harvest that oyster, and you won't get in trouble for putting the accurate time being before, earlier than a half hour before sunrise, because that is the accurate time of exposure. Does that make sense? That can be a little bit of difficult to wrap your brain around that one. And also in those intertidal areas, the oysters can only be harvested during the ebb, right? So it had an entire tidal or low tide cycle where it might have been exposed, and so we want to make sure it has natural resubmergence and maximizes the time of pumping. So we want to make sure you're not harvesting again until the ebb tide. So in the intertidal area, only harvest on the ebb tide. Now, technically, you could be in an intertidal area, but maybe your intertidal area doesn't go dry every single day. That's fine. If it didn't go dry, then you're not subject to the ebb tide restriction. But if it went dry on that prior tide, then you are restricted to the ebb tide restriction. So I know that's something that some people are concerned about. They say, well, technically my site's in the intertidal, but it only goes dry on extreme tides. I'm like, well, that's fine. You don't, just because it's called intertidal, the key is it getting exposed? If it's not getting exposed on that day, then you don't have to worry about being constrained to the ebb tide.
I have a question. So if it's on the ebb
Mm-hmm.
and high tide, it's 2 hours out, if it got exposed like an hour before high tide or low tide,
Mm-hmm.
can you not harvest them because it's already
You-
been exposed for 2 hours?
If it's already been exposed for 2 hours, that's correct. You cannot harvest it. If it's been exposed for an hour and you think you can get it to ice within that second hour, and some people have 1 hour to icing, then you can still harvest. As long as it's from the time of exposure, you meet that time to icing requirement. And if you think you can and you can't, then if it exceeds when it would naturally be exposed, if say you're culling on a float, you would have to resubmerge. But when we talk about resubmergence, we'll get into those details. Shading requirements, you really should be shading all the time, but typically it's most important and required with the Vibrio Control Plan. And you can see here on this top left, the shellfish handling. You can see, are oysters adequately iced? Yes, no. Are oysters adequately shading? So shading isn't considered a critical violation, but icing is. So adequately shaded means that you've taken measures to protect the oysters from direct exposure to sunlight. And there are different methods to do this. You could actually have an overhead shading mechanism, and that's actually the preferred way to do it because now you don't have some kind of material touching the oysters, and the materials could be, a way to introduce contamination to your oysters. And also, if it's a very hot, sunny day, some people might want to use a tarp, right? Well, if the oysters are under a tarp and the sun's beating on it, it's more likely to heat up fast because you don't have that air circulation, and it's just a little, incubator at that point. Whereas if you have an overhead shading, you have that airflow. You're not getting the oysters heated up as quickly. So if at all possible, you would want to opt to the overhead shading. But any materials in direct contact with the oysters or bags of oysters need to be smooth, easily cleanable, impervious to water. We've had some cases where people were using burlap sacks for shading, and burlap sacks are notorious for harboring bacteria. So you want to avoid, putting material on your oysters that are just going to, introduce more risk. Okay, so the icing requirement. The icing requirement has actually been updated for this Vibrio Control Plan. I think you all will feel it's a better icing requirement because we've eased up a little bit on just our prescriptive language and the amount of ice necessary. So this was in response to a lot of industry requests to reevaluate how we defined it and to give industry just a little bit more latitude in how much ice is used. If you recall, last year we changed it from the definition that was very prescriptive, saying you have to have 2 inches on the bottom, 2 inches on the sides, 2 inches in between, and 3 inches of ice on the top. And so we changed that language to say you just need to have the bag surrounded by ice. Now we further walked that back to say you don't necessarily need the bag surrounded by ice, but you need it layered, completely covered at each bag. And so what that does is if you're putting bags on a pallet or if you're putting bags in your icing container, by taking completely surrounded out, that means you don't have to leave a space between bags in the same layer. You can put your bags together and maybe use a little bit less ice because we took out that completely surrounded language. And it also gives you, a little bit more latitude to use your best professional judgment, right? We're not saying you have to have 3 inches, but if it's 90 degrees, maybe you want to use a little more ice than if it's 60 degrees. And, if immediate cooling has commenced, then, that's the definition the model ordinance requires. You have to have immediate cooling. If there's enough ice to have commencement of cooling, then it's enough ice. And so,
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
What happens if the price of ice becomes so astronomical because our electric grid is such a disaster?
mhm.
Okay. Cape, I know it personally, it's a disaster right here. If you don't have a generator on the Cape, good luck. So what I'm saying is, what happens? Because when the price of ice becomes more than the price of oysters, what, is the state thought about this?
I think that's something where, industry would have to call the state, and we'd have to try to, that's where the state would, talk to our legislators. How can we fix this? Where can we get funding? We already know it's a if people are scooping up Zamboni ice to overwinter, then already maybe you could say ice is a hardship, right? So we've been working to try to provide some funding opportunities so that we can have ice machines maybe at certain dealers, that if we buy the ice machine for the dealers, maybe they can make it available at a more reasonable price. So we know that that's an issue, and DMF is working through some grant processes to try to make ice more readily available and more, at better pricing. But yeah, that would be something that if it came to a crisis point, that's where we go to some legislators and say, hey, this is the 3rd most valuable fishery in the state behind oysters and lobsters and scallop. So if all of a sudden the industry is going to crash because of the availability of ice, what are we going to do to help this?
The other question is, are EVs more important than making ice? That's just a question.
Are electric vehicles more important than what?
Because that's a big drain on the grid. You need to make, if you start doing EVs on the Cape, you're going to increase the grid capacity 9 times, 900% what you have right now.
Yeah, there are trade-offs. We could debate
I just,
this all day, and I think it's something that we need to figure out where our priorities are when we have these conflicts. And I think a lot of this is out of our hands. It goes up the chain, but
you can make the request.
absolutely. And as you know, things have to come to a crisis point before,
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, seasonal time to icing requirements for certain growing areas. So, most of the state has 2 hours to icing. And there are a couple areas, so Edgartown, so Catawba Bay and Edgartown, and the Plymouth, Duxbury, Kingston area all have 1 hour to icing from July 1st through September 15th. And that is because they've been associated with a high incidence of illnesses from those areas. We've had requests to decrease or walk back that stringent time of stricter time of icing, but it actually wasn't bad last year. But the year before, still those 2 areas, Edgartown and the Plymouth, Duxbury, Kingston area, had the most single source illnesses that were even VP, right? So they were cultured, and we know for a fact it's VP. So until we see that change, those areas are likely to continue to be 1 hour to icing, and we've evaluated the need to apply it to other areas where we've had some high numbers of illnesses. So there's been a lot of misinformation going around about Wellfleet. Wellfleet did have an elevated number of illnesses last year, and it was mentioned during the Mass Aquaculture Association meeting that the Vibrio Control working group would be evaluating that to see if it was necessary to apply a 1 hour to icing. The conclusion was, we're not going to do it this year. We'll see what happens during this season and maybe reassess. But I don't know. I think that comments made people think that now the whole state was 1 hour to icing. Wellfleet was already 1 hour to icing. So nothing's changed in terms of the timing of icing for anybody. Everybody has the same time to icing requirements that they've had for years now.
And
Wellfleet, was that one specific area, like
No,
13, 11?
no, it was a mix, and which would be expected, right? Because the tides are so high, they pretty much drain and come back. It would be kind of hard pressed to figure out how one of those areas could sort of be isolated and have different environmental conditions that would be more conducive to Vibrio than the other. And that is why we have to consider all the different Wellfleet growing areas connected. So even if they all came from CCB 14, if we had to do a closure, it would affect all of them because the area is hydrographically connected.
On the same thing, was it wild or agriculturally grown? Which one was it that was
We have seen that they're all from aquaculturally grown so far, assuming they were tagged properly, right? So there's been some inconsistency with tags having whether they were aquaculturally grown. So if they're not wild harvested, if they were aquaculturally grown, it should be on the tag. In fact, you should have your aquaculture site listed on your tag. And Wellfleet, it probably wouldn't, make much of a difference whether it was coming from CCB 14 or CCB 11. But in other areas where people sometimes have multiple aquaculture sites in areas that are a little further apart, and maybe they're embayments, that we could make the case that perhaps it's somewhat separate, and this growing area needs to be closed but not necessarily the other one. But so it is important to try to have that information in terms of trace back for illnesses. But as far as I know, all of the illnesses have been traced back to aquaculturally reared product.
What was the range of time with all those cases? Is it spread out throughout the Vibrio season, or was that?
Yeah, pretty much. Oh, I know I said I wasn't really going to get into this slide, but I'll put it up there just for a minute. So quite a few of them. So we have the first Wellfleet illness in July, the last Wellfleet illness going into late September. And again, you can, this presentation is going to be on the website, so you can go there and take a deeper dive into the details. Okay. So the icing requirement, and the oysters need to remain adequately iced until they go to a dealer. And the dealer can meet you at the landing, or you can drive from the landing directly to the dealer. Those are the only two real options you have, unless your town has a special arrangement. Another thing we updated in the regs was allowing for towns to petition DMF, and just updating the reg to say that this was an appropriate thing to do, to allow towns to petition DMF and say, we have a certain situation. Barnstable is an example. Barnstable did this. Their landing site was so congested during the summer. There's so much going on there that became a public safety hazard to have the trucks meeting the dealers at the ramp. And so they had like a quarter of a mile down the road, another area that was town property. It had cameras on that property. They had plenty of town staff. They made the case that they can manage this appropriately to allow their harvesters to leave the landing, go onto a public road, and then meet their trucks a quarter of a mile down the road. And so because the towns showed us that they can manage it in a way that allows for compliance checking, that was something that we gave them the authorization for. And so it basically, the regulation said that the director of the Division of Marine Fisheries could do that. Okay, so more compliance monitoring, the time of icing. So time of icing again means, just like when the time of harvest means when the first oyster is plucked out of the water, the time of icing is when the last bag of oyster or last oyster in the lot has been placed in a shellfish container or considered adequately iced. And so if you're using an icing container that is like a bonar box, so it's insulated, it's smooth, it's impervious to water, it can be drained, as you can imagine, it would be pretty difficult to put the time of icing, which is when that last bag gets adequately iced, on that the tag on that first bag that went into that big bonar box. So we allow bulk tagging for just the icing tag, so a bulked icing tag. So every other bag inside that container should have a tag, and it should have all the other information on it. But for the purposes of the time of icing, you can use a single tag that says how many bags are in that container, and then when that last bag got properly iced. And of course, that means that icing container has the same harvester lot. So you can't use a single tag if you have a bunch of different lots in that container. If you have several lots, then all the different bags should have the time of icing on it, which makes it a little more difficult, but you really want to make sure it's just the one lot. And again, the same information we already talked about: time of harvest, harvest date, harvest area. Okay. And so, as I mentioned before, we updated the definition of adequate icing. No longer do we have the 2 inches. No longer do we say surrounded. We've redefined layer to mean a single thickness or coating spread out and continuously covering an entire surface. And so if we're talking about the mesh bags containing oysters, you want to make sure that the bottom of the container has a layer of ice, then you have a layer of bags, and you have a complete continuous layer of ice that completely covers each shellfish bag. So you really, you know what it means to say completely and continuously. You really don't want to have gaps in the ice. When you look down on it, you want to see a continuous layer of ice. Again, no longer are we saying it has to be 2 inches or 3 inches. If there's a layer of ice, you're good. And your layer of bags can be touching each other on the side so that the ice is only on the top and not completely surrounding the bags. For loose oysters placed into a shellfish container, they must have a layer of ice that continuously and completely covers the top of the oysters. And also the ice should be layered, right? So unlike the bags give a very clear definition of what a layer is. Loose oysters don't necessarily, but it would be a good idea to sort of mimic the thickness of a bag, right? So if you have loose oysters, when you get to about the thickness of a bag, put another layer of ice. And you want to make sure that we have that adequate icing happening. For a slurry, you use ice and water. We have no definition for how much ice to how much water. The only requirement is that the mixture of ice and water is 45 degrees. If you can get that to 45 degrees, you've got enough ice, and you just want to make sure it's maintained. The water and the ice, as I said, needs to be from an approved source. The water could be potable fresh water. I think most people just take 5-gallon buckets and they heave some water from their shellfish growing area and then dump the ice in it. So it can be water from your growing area that's in the open status, or you can have some potable water. Wholesale dealers can take on the burden of icing at the landing point, provided that it's not exceeded the 2 hours to icing or 1 hour to icing if you're in those areas. And even if the dealer is taking on the burden of icing, it is still the harvester's responsibility to make sure that the time of icing is put on your harvester tag. So you can't just hand it off and be gone. You need to make sure that they have iced it, and then you write down your time of icing on the tag, because when it comes down to the trace back, the harvester tag, is your responsibility. So even though we're saying you don't have to worry about getting the ice if your dealer wants to deal with it, you do want to make sure that it has the appropriate information on the tag. So exemptions, as I mentioned, we allowed that exemption for the dealers to take on the icing. Another thing that's new in this year's Vibrio Control Plan is we've made an exception to requiring the use of an icing container as defined, right? So insulated, smooth, impervious to water, and can be drained. We had a what we call a peer program element evaluation from the FDA last year, and this was something they pinged us on. They saw this happening, this picture, and you can see milk crates don't really fit the definition of an icing container. And so the thing with that is that's not a requirement in the model ordinance. This was sort of self-imposed by the state. So we kind of looked at the Vibrio Control Plan, and we looked at the situation, and we feel that if it's happening with aquaculturists who are also dealers, and the product is going into a refrigerated truck that is already to temperature, we're going to ease that requirement for an insulated, proper icing container. And so this case, last year, was a violation. This year, it's not going to be. So if it's going into either if you're a grower-dealer taking your own product, or even if you're a grower-dealer that buys product from your fellow growers, as long as we have a single layer of ice on top of that container and the vehicle is pre-chilled to 45 degrees, this will be allowable this year. Okay, so again, Vibrio compliance monitoring. Again, this top part is on that compliance monitoring form. You can see these are all black. They're violations, but they're not considered criticals. Transport requirements. So all market-bound oysters need to be transported by the commercial fishermen or aquaculturists or their employee. So if you have employees, they should have an employee transaction card associated with your parent permit. And it needs to go directly to the primary buyer or dealer. That can happen at the landing site, or if it doesn't happen at the landing site, unless you have some other arrangement like the Barnstable one I mentioned, you have to go directly to their brick and mortar dealer facility. Those are the only options. You can't meet them on the highway and make that transaction. It can only happen at the landing or at their facility. And these transactions need to be, have both parties present. Right, so you're not supposed to be leaving product at the dealer after hours and then they pick it up when they open the next day. You need to have both parties present for the transaction. And this is another thing to keep in mind. This isn't really a violation on harvesters, but it kind of is on harvesters because technically the dealer should be rejecting anything that they couldn't check was down to temperature. So they have to, the time to temperature requirement with the dealer's HACCP plan requires that it's less than 45 degrees within 10 hours of harvest. So if you don't get there until 11 hours after harvest, they're not supposed to be taking that product. So it means it's also a burden on you to get the product to the dealers within 10 hours of harvest. No off-site culling of market-bound product prior to delivery. So you're not supposed to take it home and cull it and then take it to the dealer. It's supposed to go directly from the harvest site to the dealer. And there's no overnight holding for a morning delivery. And again, no unattended drop-offs at the dealer facility or anywhere else. Okay, logbooks. I think a lot of you have grabbed your logbooks already. Surprisingly, with all the regulations and the controls we have on associated with the Vibrio Control Plan, it seems these logbooks get you more than anything else. You guys do not like these logbooks. But unfortunately, you are required to have the logbook on you at all times. So we're happy to give you 2. They're free, despite Alex saying they're going to be $5. They're still free. If you have product going to a dealer because you have an employee who's taken it, then maybe you want to have a logbook that is just for market-bound product. And maybe you want to have a logbook that just stays on the site. If you're on your site, you should have a logbook on you. And that is so that you can, if you need to resubmerge product, you have the ability to document it. Now, we've had people say, but I don't resubmerge product. I have my operation down to a science. I make sure that all my culling's done either within the period of low tide. So if the product is exposed for 3 hours, but it's always exposed for 3 hours naturally with the tide, then you don't have to resubmerge it. But if it's not usually exposed, then, and you're taking it out of the water for 3 hours, then you have to resubmerge, and we will get into resubmergence details in a minute. But that could happen. Even if you never do it, you know, something could happen. You get a phone call, and now all of a sudden, product that you thought you were going to be finished culling and have in the water within the 2 hours wasn't. And you didn't think you needed a logbook on your person because you never need it. You don't resubmerge, right? It's for that purpose. If you have to resubmerge, you're supposed to be able to document it in the logbook immediately. If your shellfish constable or an environmental police officer goes up to your site and wants to know if you're resubmerging, they're going to want your logbook. So even if you just keep a blank one that you never ever, fill out because you don't resubmerge in your boat somewhere, so that if you're on your site and your log book that actually has entries is off with your employee meeting the dealer, that you have one on your person. You can stick it in a plastic bag. They float. We went out. We were out doing a site visit. I think we were in Edgartown, and it was kind of snotty out. It was not a pleasant day to be out there, and I'm like, what better way to just see how difficult it is to retrieve this? And I just flung it off the boat, and I retrieved it. It floats. It's waterproof. Yes, we get them back all dirty and dingy, and that's expected, but it is something that you're required to have on your person, and you're required to, use it in real time, right? We don't want you to be trying to remember what you did earlier in the day and fill it out later. It's supposed to be filled out pretty much as close to the time of harvest as possible. And so you want to write an indelible link, and you want to make sure that your employees have access to it if you're not there. Okay, there's the logbook. Okay, so here are the pages of the logbook. It's sort of separated into two different tables. The top table is for any product that's being either market bound or harvested for direct human consumption. So it has the date, the harvest area. You want the site ID for your grant, or you can put W if you're a wild harvester. Again, all wild harvesters have to adhere to the Vibrio Control plan as well. The quantity of product, and then the time of harvest or exposure, the time of icing, and then you want to put on the far right the dealer who bought your product. If you're taking it home for personal consumption, you can put PC. And, again, all the same information, the time. Personal consumption, you're not really required to follow the icing. I highly recommend that you do. Put it in a cooler and put some ice on it, because you don't want to be taking product home that's going to be abused and potentially get your family sick either. So, but as I mentioned, whenever you're taking product or have product in possession, you should have a tag that basically describes the disposition. Is it going to a dealer? Is it going to cull? Or is it taking it home to consume? Some of the red flags that we have, certainly the FDA has pinged on these log books where all of the times, whether it's the time of exposure or time of icing, is like on the hour, on the quarter past or half hour. It's highly unlikely that that's always the case, and since we're supposed to put the exact time, that's sort of something that they have honed in on, is just to remind people that it needs to be the exact time. There shouldn't all be zeros or fives over there. Also, in this particular case, we have a harvest at CCB 42, which has 1 hour to icing. We can see the time of exposure and the time of icing is a violation of the time to icing. On the bottom is where we document all our resubmergence. And so we're going to get into the details of resubmergence, but if you have not met the time to icing requirements, then product is going to have to be tagged and segregated on your site and basically soak for 10 days before you can harvest it again. And so when you have to do that, that bottom table is where you document it. So we have the date removed from site, and then the date resubmerged, the harvest area, the site, the quantity, and then you want to have an accounting of how many oysters, whether it's bags or individuals, and the category. If you look at the bottom, we have resubmergence categories. So there's one, air drying for anti-fouling. So sometimes people will just put it out and maybe a couple days to try to get the fouling organisms to die off. Other times it's culling activities. Now within the culling activities, that could be culling, sorting, grading, whatever husbandry activities that you would be doing that would have it out of the water. And so if they've gone past those 2 hours or 1 hour in those other areas, then you have to resubmerge. And that you can do on your own. You should have some communication with your shellfish constables to let them know what you're doing if you're moving, large amounts of product off your site. But you don't need DMF permission to resubmerge in those cases. In the other categories, so non-compliance at the dealer or if there's a recall. So let's say there is an outbreak, and DMF and DPH require your growing area to be closed, and product was harvested after that. All that product would have to be recalled and brought back from the different markets. And it's often not as easy as you would think, because product moves very quickly. It goes out of state very quickly. It's consumed very quickly. And so if product has not left the original dealer, we will allow it to be resubmerged. So if the person who bought it from you still has it, we'll allow them. You have to have permission, and we will have the Shellfish Constable witness the resubmergence, only because we know that this product is associated with illness now. We just have a little bit extra verification of the resubmergence and the segregation on your site. If it's gone past the primary buyer, then it's in all likelihood going to have to get destroyed. Mm-hmm.
When you talk about a closure,
Mm-hmm.
If there's an outbreak and there's a closure of a certain area, what's the mechanism to reopen that area?
It depends on the reason for the closure. So for Vibrio, we have a 7-day closure at 4 illnesses in 30 days.
Yeah, that's a state self-imposed one, just as a sort of preventative measure to avoid 14-day closures or 21-day closures.
Yeah. So we found that sometimes when we have illnesses coming in, there's just a little bit of a lag time. Sometimes there's a huge lag time, and we actually, it wasn't Vibrio, it was noro, but we had norovirus. We had notification that there was an event that reached the definition of outbreak. I think it was 7 people at a restaurant. Like the whole party got sick. And it was Massachusetts oysters, and it was like 6 weeks. It was in December. The product had been harvested 6 weeks earlier, and we really pushed back on that closure because it's norovirus. You know, like if I had norovirus right now, there's a good chance you all leave this room with norovirus, right? Eating oysters is not the primary way to get norovirus. There are so many mechanisms for it being transmitted. And so not only that, that's the only illness. That one, granted it was 7 people and they didn't all live together and like pretty much everybody got sick, but that was the only case from an area that had hundreds of thousands of oysters coming from that area. So if that growing area had a norovirus problem, considering just how virulent and it's not like Vibrio where only really compromised people get sick. Norovirus, in all likelihood, you're getting sick if you have exposure. We all are very susceptible to norovirus if we get that exposure. So it was exceedingly unlikely that that area had a norovirus problem, and we didn't see any other cases anywhere else. So we do have some discretion to push back and look at the facts, but the model ordinance does require 14-day closures after a certain number of illnesses, 21-day closures after another certain number of illnesses. In other cases like biotoxin, so NOSIT, as you know, we have to have 3 toxin scores that are decreasing over 3 weeks that are below the threshold where we have to quarantine. So the clock doesn't even start until we get that first toxin score that's underneath the required threshold. For PSP, it's 80 micrograms of toxin per 100 grams of shellfish. So as soon as we hit that less than 80, we need to get 2 more lowering ones. So they have to be decreasing, and they have to be 3 in a row, and we have to have at least a week in between each test. And so we're at least 3 weeks out at any given time for PSP closures. So it really does depend, and it also depends on what the closure was about. So if we have a closure for a red tide of any kind because we see the cells in the water, it depends on how much. If there are so many cells where we're like, oh no, we can't get this stuff tested fast enough, we might issue a precautionary closure. And so if it was a precautionary closure and we never actually confirmed that there were toxins in the shellfish, if when we do confirm it, we can just pop it right open. We don't have to have 3 weeks of testing. So it's nuanced. It depends on what the risk is. If it's, you don't necessarily have it in your area, but in my neck of the woods in Buzzards Bay and around areas, the large urban areas that have wastewater treatment plant outfalls, but also combined sewer overflows. Sewage is a mandatory 21-day closure unless we test 7 days for a certain thing. So there's not one easy answer. It depends on why we're closing it and what the potential public health risk is. But for Vibrio, again, it depends on how many illnesses. So it could be 7 days, it could be 14 days, it could be 21 days. But we do have the ability to look at the timing of when we got notified, because sometimes these notifications are just not timely. Like we just found out today that somebody got sick 2 months ago, and we're going to close it down now. So if we can show that the environmental conditions are different today, it's, in August it was, warm temperatures and maybe the risk for Vibrio was higher, but it's now November or, October. The environmental conditions are different. We think the risk factors are different, and it's really just punitive to close you down at that point, right? It's been 2 months since the illness, and we haven't had any other illnesses. So there's a little bit of discretion there, and we have to do a little bit of legwork to try to make our case to say, no, we're not going to close. But there are some required mandatory closures depending on what the level of illness is. You're welcome. Okay, so culling, sorting, air drying, and resubmergence. So these apply only to aquaculturists. Wild harvesters do not have the ability to resubmerge. A wild harvester's only option is to harvest in the wild and go directly to a dealer. There is no holding of oysters on an aquaculture site at all. So for oyster culture activities, and that basically means any of these animal husbandry activities that require you to take the animals out of the water. So you can cull on site, you can utilize, if you're in an intertidal zone, you can use the entire tidal cycle when it would be naturally exposed to do your culling activities. But if you're having to remove your oysters from the site or have them out of the water beyond when they would naturally be exposed, you want to track that. So market-sized oysters can be brought on barges or boats and culled as long as they stay within the growing area. So you can go off your site a little bit on your boat and be working, especially if it's sort of a crappy day and it's, it's just kind of choppy and you want to maybe go in a more protected area to do your culling. As long as you're staying in your growing area, that product will not be considered off-site culled, even though technically, you're off your site. But if you're actually going outside of your growing area and going on land, that's off-site culled. And so all your oyster activity that when you're culling, any oyster activities that exceed 2 hours or 1 hour if you're in those specific areas from the time of harvest or time of exposure have to be subjected to resubmergence. And so that requires you to segregate on your site, we should have resubmergence plans. That's something that we haven't really been strict about, and the FDA is kind of coming down on us about it. So we may have to try to help facilitate these resubmergence plans, even if it's getting some kind of template. We kind of do it in your annual reports and in your application process. We ask you how you're resubmerging, but it might be something where we require something more substantial because we're being told we have to do that. So, but basically you need to tell us how you're tracking this. How are you documenting and keeping track of how you're resubmerging, especially if you have several lots, right? This lot was resubmerged on this date and this lot on that date, and you can only, the time when this lot can be harvested is on Tuesday, but the time when this lot can be harvested is on Friday. So we want to make sure that you have a plan in place and you're organized so that you know when it's time to harvest those resubmerged lots. When your oyster culture activities do not exceed 2 hours or 1 hour, you can put it back on your site and harvest it the next calendar day. So Duxbury is an example of that, where they have some culling floats right on their site. So if it doesn't exceed the 2 hours, you can put it back in the water the next calendar day. It's basically, if you're taking it on land, it's considered off-site culled, and it needs to have the 10-day resubmergence. Okay, we kind of went over quite a bit of this already. So off-site cull needs that 10 days resubmergence prior to harvesting. It's the culling activities should be listed on your propagation permit, so you're not allowed to just take it on land if you don't have that specific location listed on your propagation permit as an approved off-site culling location. This is something, the third bullet here, we don't really pay too much attention to. So one of the conditions on your permit is that prior to the removal of any shell stock from the licensed site for those activities, harvesters are required to notify the local municipal shellfish authority. We've kind of just let the local shellfish departments handle that how they see fit. I can't imagine if Johnny and Nancy had to get a call every single time one of you 100 growers wanted to off-site cull, but so we let that be managed how the town wants to manage that. So again, in intertidal areas, you may cull oysters on your site during the period when it's exposed, even if it's exposed for 3 hours. If it's always exposed for 3 hours every day, you don't have to have a 10-day resubmergence. We actually did a resubmergence study where we temperature abused oysters. Gabe, I think you even picked like a 90-degree day. So it was pretty darn close to worst case scenario for temperature abuse. And we found that oysters that came from intertidal sites that are used to being exposed, they were just conditioned to just hurry up and restart pumping as soon as they're back in the water. And so they actually purged a little faster than the subtidal oysters. They're not used to being exposed. And so they were stressed a little more being exposed. And so it took a little bit longer once they got put back in the water to start pumping again. And so that's why, because people have asked that, well, wait a minute, how come that oyster that's been exposed by the tide for 4 hours doesn't have to be resubmerged, but if I go 3 hours, I have to, or 2.5 hours, I have to resubmerge. If that's used to it, it's naturally happening with every tidal cycle. We're not going to, because you'd never be able to harvest that site. Every tidal cycle would re-trigger, the resubmergence 10-day cycle. So, and we do have some, evidence, experimental evidence that shows they actually do purge faster in the intertidal zone than what they were in the subtidal. And you're encouraged to do what you need to keep track of that time. So once you start your culling practices, when you have, product that's being exposed to the ambient air, whether it's you mark down the time when you pulled it out of the water, or you start a stopwatch, you really want to track that as best you can. Okay, so resubmergence of non-compliant oysters. I mentioned the other categories where we have non-compliant oysters. So it could be where we have an illness or an illness outbreak, we have to close it down. And so again, we'll allow product that didn't leave the primary buyer to be resubmerged. There's also the case where maybe your dealer's refrigerator died, right? So now those are now oysters that are non-compliant. So we would allow the dealer to give it back to you in that case. In some cases, non-compliant oysters may be due to a violation. So I mentioned all those reds, the critical violations. In all likelihood, those oysters are going to get destroyed if it's a critical violation where it wasn't iced properly, it wasn't iced within the time it needed to be iced. Again, there's no holding of oysters on wild oysters on aquaculture sites. So if it's a wild oyster, if it's, I guess depending on what the actual violation is, if it's a public health violation, it's probably going to be destroyed. There is some initiatives to try to figure out if there are some cases where maybe the environmental police officers could donate it for cooked product, say a food bank or something like that to prevent the waste of destruction. But that's something that's being considered. And as I said, in the case of it coming back from the primary buyer, especially if the closure is due to illness, we will ask that the shellfish constables witness that. And we do have a document to fill out showing that the constable witnessed the segregation. Okay, so we already talked about that. And we pretty much already talked about that. Why destruction? You know, another thing is if it's sort of a really glaring violation by the harvester, the destruction is also, it's a little more painful, right? And so, especially in areas like Wellfleet, like, you know, Eastham, where there are a lot of growers in one area, one person not doing the right thing could ruin it for a lot of people and shut them down for an extended period of time. So that's one of the reasons for the destruction. One harvester's poor actions can result in potentially life-threatening illness, and also, you know, the closure of multiple growing areas and losses for, you know, a larger segment of the industry. And so the critical violations tend to be associated with incomplete tagging and improper icing. I thought about taking this slide out. This URL code takes you to our training videos. They are very much outdated now. We talked about the changes to the icing. In this particular slide, I highlight that when these videos were produced, the required resubmergence was 14 days. Now it's 10 days. So it is worth still viewing those videos because it gives some background. A lot of it you heard plenty of right here. But these videos do need to be updated. There's a lot of outdated information now. And also, just want to make you aware of some tools. So our federal partners have created this Vibrio predictive model tool. So if you were looking at your week and you were trying to plan out your week and you want to minimize your risk, this tool identifies periods or times of the day when harvest would be especially risky. So maybe you would want to time your harvest so that you're harvesting during less risky periods. So it's not a mandatory tool, but if you want to check it out, that's the URL code to get there. And that is it. So I'm happy to take some questions.